Iron ore in one end, a finished car the other. Same building, same day in some cases. No trucks full of parts showing up from 100 different suppliers, just coal, sand, rubber, and raw ore going in and a running automobile coming out less than 48 hours later. That's not an exaggeration for YouTube. That's what Henry Ford actually built on the banks of the Rouge River in Dearborn, Michigan. And today, we're breaking down how a single factory complex came closer than anything in history to building a car completely from scratch. By the mid-1910s, Henry Ford had already revolutionized the automobile with the moving assembly line at Highland Park. But Highland Park had a problem that gnawed at Ford constantly. It depended on outside suppliers. Steel came from other companies. Glass came from other companies. If a supplier raised prices, went on strike, or simply couldn't keep up with Model T demand, Ford's own production ground to a halt. Ford hated depending on anyone. So Ford started buying. He acquired iron ore deposits in northern Michigan and up near Lake Superior. He bought coal mines in Kentucky and West Virginia. He bought timberland and built his own sawmills. He even purchased his own fleet of Great Lakes freighters to haul the ore and coal himself, and his own railroad to move it around once it arrived. The plan was total self-sufficiency. Ford didn't want to build cars. He wanted to build the entire industrial chain that made cars possible under one roof, on one clock. That vision needed a location big enough to hold it. Highland Park couldn't do it, so Ford turned to a stretch of marshland along the Rouge River, southwest of Detroit. Ford actually bought roughly 2,000 acres along the Rouge River back around 1915. And at that point, he didn't even have a firm industrial plan for it. Some accounts say he initially considered turning part of the property into a bird sanctuary. That changed fast once World War I broke out. The U.S. Navy needed small, quickly built anti-submarine vessels called Eagle boats, and Ford Motor Company took the contract to build them at the Rouge site. To get those boats out to open water, Ford had to dredge and widen the Rouge River itself, cutting a channel deep enough for ocean-going traffic. That single decision ended up being the key that unlocked everything that came after, because it meant ore freighters from Minnesota and coal barges from Appalachia could sail directly to docks built right on the property. Raw materials could arrive by water instead of relying entirely on rail, which cut cost and time out of the entire operation before a single part was even made. Construction of the real industrial complex began around 1917 and 1918, with Ford's longtime architect Albert Kahn designing most of the major buildings. By the time the Rouge was substantially complete around 1928, it had grown into something without precedent. 90-plus buildings, roughly 16 million square feet of factory floor, and a footprint about 1.5 miles wide by more than 1 mile long. People at the time didn't call it a factory, they called it an industrial city. Here's where the Rouge actually earns the claim in this video's title. Ore boats would dock right at the Rouge, and cranes would unload iron ore, coal, and limestone directly into massive storage bins along the riverbank. From there, conveyors moved the coal into coking ovens, which baked it down into coke, the concentrated fuel needed to run blast furnaces. The first coke ovens went into operation around 1919, with blast furnaces coming online in 1920 and 1922. Inside those blast furnaces, iron ore, coke, and limestone were combined and superheated until the ore reduced down into molten iron. And this is the detail that made the Rouge genuinely unique. The foundry sat close enough to the blast furnaces that the molten iron could be poured directly into molds without ever cooling down and being reheated. Ford's own specialized rail cars, essentially mobile ladles, carried the molten metal straight from the furnace to the foundry floor. That foundry was reportedly the largest in the world at the time, and it's where Ford cast engine blocks, cylinder heads, and other major iron components right out of metal that hours earlier had been rock pulled out of the ground in Minnesota. Separately, open hearth furnaces and rolling mills turned refined iron into actual sheet steel, which then got stamped into body panels, fenders, and frame components in the Rouge's own stamping plant. So by this point in the process, you've got ore to engine and ore to body panel happening inside the same several hundred acres. Glass is one of the parts of this story people don't expect, but it might be the most impressive piece of vertical integration in the whole complex. Ford built a glass plant at the Rouge that opened around 1923, and it didn't just cut glass to size, it manufactured the glass itself, starting from raw sand, soda ash, and limestone melted down in furnaces and rolled out into continuous sheets. Ford's engineers had actually helped develop a continuous rolling process for plate glass that was faster and cheaper than the older method of casting individual plates and grinding them flat one at a time. That process mattered a lot once Ford moved to the Model A in 1928, because the Model A was among the first low-priced cars to use laminated safety glass as standard equipment in its windshield. By around 1930, that safety glass itself was being produced in-house at the Rouge as well. So a windshield on a Ford in this era could trace back to sand and chemicals that walked in the front gate of the same plant that built the engine underneath it. Tires were the one raw material Ford couldn't dig out of Michigan or Kentucky. Rubber trees don't grow in the American Midwest, and in the 1920s, the global rubber trade was largely controlled by British and Dutch plantation interests in Southeast Asia, which set prices Ford didn't like one bit. So, in 1927, Ford went and bought roughly 2.5 million acres of land along the Tapajós River in the Brazilian Amazon, with the plan of growing his own rubber trees, controlling his own tire supply, and cutting out the middlemen entirely. He called the settlement Fordlandia. On paper, it fit the exact same philosophy as the Rouge: control the raw material, control the whole chain. In practice, it was a disaster. Ford's people planted the rubber trees close together, plantation style, the way you'd plant corn or wheat back home. But those trees are native to the Amazon specifically because they grow spread out, which keeps the leaf blight and insects that evolved alongside them from spreading from tree to tree. Planted close together, the trees got wiped out repeatedly by disease. On top of that, Ford tried to import an American company town lifestyle onto Brazilian workers, right down to insisting on Midwestern food and clocks set to Detroit time, which caused serious friction and at least one outright riot in the late 1920s. Fordlandia and a second nearby plantation called Belterra never came close to producing enough rubber to matter, and Ford Motor Company finally sold off the whole operation to the Brazilian government in 1945, having sunk something like $20 million into it. Back at the Rouge itself, though, the tire plant it did have kept running fine on rubber Ford still had to import the traditional way. Fordlandia is really the exception that proves the rule. Everywhere Ford could source a raw material domestically and industrially, the vertical integration model worked. The one time nature and culture didn't cooperate with an assembly line mindset, it fell apart. It's worth just sitting with the numbers for a second, because they're staggering even by today's standards. At its peak in the late 1920s and 1940s, the Rouge complex had its own power plant, generating enough electricity to run the entire site and still sell surplus power to Detroit Edison. It had over 100 miles of interior railroad track and its own fleet of locomotives, more than a dozen of them just for internal use, moving raw material in and finished parts out. Some 27 to 120 miles of conveyor belts, depending on which year you're counting, physically stitched the buildings together. Roughly 53,000 machine tools were installed across the complex. At its employment peak, more than 100,000 people worked at the Rouge. That's not a typo. 100,000 in one industrial complex on one site. In 1948 alone, the plant's internal railroad moved over 1,600 freight cars a day, and roughly 850,000 tons of ore and 2.5 million tons of coal arrived by boat that year to feed the furnaces. Ford even kept a dedicated cleaning and maintenance staff of more than 5,000 people, whose entire job was just keeping the place painted and presentable. And the output matched the input. Once fully up and running, the Rouge was capable of producing around 4,000 vehicles a day. Ford's own promotional materials in the era claimed a complete car could go from raw iron ore to a finished vehicle rolling off the line in as little as 28 hours. Whether every single vehicle actually made that exact number is beside the point. The fact that it was even a believable claim for any car tells you how tightly Ford had compressed the entire supply chain. If the Rouge worked this well, why doesn't every automaker build cars this way today? A few reasons, and they're worth understanding because they explain the entire structure of the modern auto industry. First, vertical integration only pays off when you're making enormous volumes of one thing. Ford could justify owning a steel mill because Ford needed steel by the trainload every single day for years on end. As the auto industry matured and model variety exploded, a single company running its own mines, mills, and plantations became a much harder bet to keep profitable, especially once the Great Depression hit and demand cratered. Second, owning the entire chain means owning the entire risk. When steel demand outstripped what your own furnaces could produce, or when your own rubber plantation failed, you didn't have a backup supplier to lean on, because you were supposed to be the supplier. Outside vendors, spread across many customers, can absorb shocks that a fully captive operation can't. Third, labor. A complex this size, with this much leverage over the region's entire industrial economy, became a massive flashpoint in American labor history. The Rouge was the site of the Battle of the Overpass in 1937, one of the most infamous confrontations of the UAW's organizing campaign against Ford. Managing that many workers under one roof, doing everything from mining-adjacent work to final assembly, made labor relations far more complicated than a company that only builds cars. Over the following decades, the industry drifted the other way entirely, toward specialization. Steel companies got very good at steel. Glass companies got very good at glass. Automakers focused on engineering and final assembly and let suppliers compete against each other on cost and quality. That's the model that basically every automaker uses today, and it's the exact opposite of what Ford built at the Rouge. The Rouge complex is still there, and Ford still builds vehicles at portions of it today, though it's a fraction of what it once was and looks nothing like the ore-to-car operation of the 1920s and 40s. The blast furnaces are long gone. Several of the original Albert Kahn buildings have been demolished or heavily altered over the decades, but the stamping plant, the engine plant, the tool and die building, and the old powerhouse still stand, and portions of the site are recognized as a National Historic Landmark. Ford also runs a public tour today that lets visitors walk the current assembly floor and see the site's history laid out. Though what's on display now is a modern automotive plant, not the raw material powerhouse this video has been describing. For a brief window in the 20th century, one company controlled the entire journey from ore in the ground to a finished car in the driveway, all inside a few hundred acres in Dearborn. That level of vertical integration has never really been matched since, and it probably never will be again. Let me know in the comments what part of this surprised you the most. Thanks for watching.